Today's topic is the rest of hypothermia, that is frostbite, and we'll deal with some heat-related illnesses. So, what is frostbite? So, peripheral cold injuries, they have both freezing and non-freezing injuries. These freezing injuries or non-freezing injuries, they occur once the tissue temperature drops below 0 degrees Celsius, that is below 32 degrees Fahrenheit. There is one more entity which is called as frost nip. This may precede the frostbite. So what is frost nip? Frost nip is initial damage to the skin tissue, to any tissue for that matter. So it is a non-freezing cold injury resulting from intense vasoconstriction of exposed acral skin. What are the predisposing factors? Like, do everyone end up having frostbite, or are there any predisposing factors? So any contact with thermal conductors such as metal and volatile solutions, wearing constrictive clothing or boots, immobility, vasoconstrictive medications usage. So all these are predisposing factors for frostbite. So what happens actually is, once someone comes in contact with a cold temperature or some ice, the ice crystal formation occurs. So this crystal formation, this distorts and destroys the cellular architecture. Because of this destruction, there will be vascular endothelium damage. This damage leads to stasis in the vessels. This stasis progresses rapidly, and it also leads to microvascular thrombosis. Once the tissue thaws, there is progressive dermal ischemia. And this ischemia, because of this dermal ischemia and microvascular thrombosis, the microvasculature begins to collapse. And AV shunting increases tissue pressures, and because of increase in the tissue pressure, there will be edema formation. So because of all this, there will be thrombosis, ischemia, and superficial necrosis. But for a proper demarcation of a normal tissue and a frostbitten tissue to occur and the development of mummification, it takes many weeks to months. How does the patient present? Usually the patients have sensory symptoms. Usually they'll have a light sensory deficiency, which affects the light touch, pain, and temperature, especially in acral areas and distal extremities. The patient typically describes this sensation as clumsy or chunk of wood sensation in the extremities. How does these frostbitten tissues look like? The deep frostbitten tissue, they'll appear very waxy, mottled, yellow, or violaceous white. So this is the frostbitten tissue. It looks waxy. It's all like shiny and all, and you have blood formation also. So this is more damage has been done, where you can see erythema here, and there is ulceration leading to the loss of skin tissue. There is gangrenous tissue also over the foot. So there are some favorable presenting signs, like if these are there in the patient, the limb or the extremity will be salvaged. So what are those? If there is warmth or some normal color is there with normal sensation in the limb, then it is a favorable presenting sign. If the subcutaneous tissue is pliable, or you can pinch or roll the dermis over any bony prominence, then these are all favorable presenting signs. So there are, if it is, the frostbite is only superficial, it only causes anesthesia and erythema. But appearance of vesiculation surrounded by edema and erythema, this will imply a deeper involvement and more damage to the tissue. We can classify frostbite into 4 grades. So grade 1 is just absence of cyanosis. There will be just mild edema and erythema. Grade 2 is cyanosis is present on the distal phalanx. Grade 3 will be cyanosis up to metacarpophalangeal joint. And grade 4 will be cyanosis proximal to the metacarpophalangeal joint. So there are 2 non-freezing tissue injuries. These are called chilblain or pernio, and another one is immersion foot or trench foot. So what are these? Chilblain, this results from neuronal and endothelial damage induced by repetitive exposure to damp cold above the freezing point. So it is induced by repetitive exposure to damp cold above the freezing point. Usually young females are affected more, and especially those who have a history of Raynaud's phenomenon. They are at greatest risk of developing these chilblains. And there is persistent vasospasticity and vasculitis, which will cause erythema, mild edema, and pruritus. There will be formation of plaques, blue nodules, and ulcerations over the dorsa of the hands and feet. So this red sore bumps, these are the signs of chilblains. The other one is immersion foot or trench foot. This results from repetitive exposure to wet cold. That was damp cold, and this is wet cold above the freezing point. The feet initially appear cyanotic, cold, and edematous, and bullae develop very rapidly, and they progress to ulceration and liquefaction gangrene. So initially there is bullae formation, and these bullae, they rapidly develop into ulceration and liquefaction gangrene. And mild cases, usually they report with hyperhidrosis, cold sensitivity, and painful ambulation for many years, even after they have been treated. So this is an example of immersion foot, where there is a loss of all the superficial skin, there is ulceration over the feet, and all wrinkling of the skin is seen. Another example where they have all wrinkling is there and they have ulceration. How do you treat these? Any frozen tissue, it should be immediately thawed and completely thawed by immersion in circulating water. The water should be at 37 to 40 degrees Celsius. And they have to be immersed for half an hour to 1 hour, half an hour to 1 hour, 30 to 60 minutes. So rapid rewarming often produces an initial hyperemia. Initially the extremity will become red, but then early formation of clear distal blebs is more favorable. So if the blebs formation is there and they are large clear blebs, this is more favorable as compared to small proximal dark hemorrhagic blebs. So hemorrhagic blebs, they show that it is a deeper involvement. So how do you treat? You have to give parenteral narcotics. So any amount of analgesia is not going to be very effective in these cases. If cyanosis persists even after rewarming, the tissue compartment should be tested for pressures. So if there is, you have to check whether there is any compartmental syndromes. So the treatment goes like this: before thawing, what should you do? During thawing, what should you do? And after thawing, what should you do? So before thawing, you have to remove the patient from the cold environment, and you prevent partial thawing and refreezing. Core temperature should be stabilized, and hypothermia should be treated. And frozen part should be protected nicely. You should not massage, you should not give any friction to the frozen part. And if there are any additional medical or surgical conditions, you have to treat those. During thawing, so you have to give analgesia, and even ketorolac can be given. IV injections can be given. Orally, you can give ibuprofen, and you have to immerse the part in 37 to 40 degrees Celsius, so which has to be monitored by a thermometer. And this water should also contain antiseptic soap, and this should be immersed till there is a distal flush. That is, it takes approximately 10 to 45 minutes. So you have to immerse the part in warm water at around 37 to 40 degrees Celsius, which also has antiseptic soap. And you encourage the patient to move the part gently, so that little movement is possible. And once the patient is moving, it also takes care of increased circulation. If the pain is refractory, you can reduce the water temperature to 35 to 37 degrees Celsius, and you can also give parenteral narcotics. So after thawing, the thawing is done, then you remove the part and you gently dry and protect it. You elevate the feet, and you can place pledgets between toes, that is if they are macerated, so that they don't, there is no friction and they dry off easily. If clear vesicles are intact, then you can aspirate with taking sterile precautions, aseptic precautions. And if it is broken, you can debride and dress with antibiotic or sterile aloe vera ointment. So if it is intact, you can just aspirate it with taking aseptic precautions. If it is broken, you debride and dress with antibiotic or sterile aloe vera ointment. If there are hemorrhagic vesicles, you leave them. You don't do anything. Let them be intact so that there will be no desiccation and infection. So if you are going to deal with hemorrhagic vesicles, you can introduce infection. So instead of doing anything, you just keep quiet. You leave the hemorrhagic vesicles for them to heal properly. And ibuprofen has to be continued either 8th hourly or 12th hourly. So it can be given in a dose of 400 to 600 orally. So, because there is ulceration and there will be gangrene, you have to give tetanus injection, and streptococcal prophylaxis also has to be given, and the part should be elevated. And the hydrotherapy can be administered at 37 degrees Celsius. So for maybe because we want better circulation, you can also give dextran or enoxabenzoate. If it is severe cases, if there is severe thrombosis, even intravenous or intraarterial thrombolysis with RTPA can also be considered. Now that finishes frostbite. So we are left with heat-related illnesses. So what are these? So there is a lot of terminology in these. First one is heat edema. So what is heat edema? Just when you go into the sun, if there is a mild swelling of the hands and feet and ankles. So if you immediately after the initial heat, it can cause mild swelling of the extremities, and there will be cutaneous vasodilatation and pooling of interstitial fluid. Because of this, there will be edema. This occurs in response to the heat stress. Heat also increases secretion of antidiuretic hormone and aldosterone. So this usually it resolves on its own. You need not treat anything, but it will take some time. It may take a few days. Simple leg elevation, or you can give a high support hose. This will suffice. Diuretics are usually not advised because they are not effective and they may worsen the condition. So diuretics are not advised for heat edema. So you just need to take some history. If the patient has been in heat and there is a heat stress and there is mild edema, you can just leave it like that. You have to reassure the patient and you can leave it just like that with simple leg elevation. The other one, many of us have these prickly heat. Whenever there is heat summer, you go in the summer. This is also called as miliaria rubra or lichen tropicus. So what happens is there is a maculopapular pruritic erythematous rash. This usually occurs in the clothed areas. It does not occur in the exposed parts. It occurs in the clothed areas. And why these maculopapular rash erupts is because there is blockage of the sweat pores by debris from macerated stratum corneum, and this causes inflammation in the sweat ducts. So there is inflammation in the sweat ducts because of blockage of sweat pores. And these ducts, as they dilate, they rupture and they produce superficial vesicles. And the predominant symptom in this is pruritus. Intense itching will be there. Once you scratch, it is going to cause secondary infection. So you have to just tell the patient not to scratch. And if at all, you can give a mild antihistaminics, or you can also go for chlorhexidine in a light cream or lotion, or even salicylic acid can be given. 1% salicylic acid can be given, but toxicity of salicylic acid has to be taken care of. You have to just look into that. It can be given in a TID dose, but you have to just see that it is not taken in an overdose. Clothing should be with breathable fabric and it should be clean and loose fitting. You should not wear tight fitting clothes in summer seasons. So you have to also avoid activities and environments which induce diaphoresis. So sweating, if there is excessive sweating in the heat environment, this will lead to prickly heat. So wearing free loose clothes, clean and breathable fabric clothes is enough. You can also give antihistamines for pruritus. So this is an example of prickly heat, miliaria rubra. So this is on the back. The next one is heat syncope. So this heat syncope, it usually follows exercise endurance. You have, if you do an exercise in the heat, especially in the elderly, this occurs when the elderly person or is doing exercise in heat and they stand for a long time and doing nothing. They stand just stationary in the heat. This occurs. factors. So sudden standing even after prolonged exposure to heat also causes heat syncope. So usually the body is in an effort to cool itself, and this causes the blood vessels to dilate to such an extent that the blood flow to the brain is reduced and the patient has a syncopal attack. So heat stress routinely causes relative volume depletion, decreased vasomotor tone, and peripheral vasodilatation. And the cumulative effect of this decrease, in turn, it decreases the venous return and causes postural hypotension. Treatment is nothing but you remove the person from the heat source, you have to cool them, and you have to give rehydrating fluids. Another entity is hyperventilation tetany. Hyperventilation tetany is as someone is exposed to heat, they start hyperventilating. Once there is hyperventilation, it produces respiratory alkalosis. Respiratory alkalosis also leads to paresthesias and carpopedal spasm. For this, you just need to reassure the patient. You can move the patient out of the heat, and you have to address the hyperventilation. So this is a typical carpopedal spasm in a patient with heat exposure. The other entity is heat cramps. So what are these? These cramps, they occur when the patient is usually not accustomed to the heat and they do vigorous exercise in humid or hot environment. So there will be intermittent, painful, involuntary spasmodic contractions of the skeletal muscles. There will be intermittent, painful, involuntary spasmodic contractions of the skeletal muscles. Occur in the unacclimatized patient who is at rest after vigorous exercise in a humid or hot environment. The patient usually profusely sweats profusely and replaces fluid with lots of water, just plain water they take, and because of this there will be loss of other electrolytes. So the patient drinks lots of water. So this is how it happens. So predisposing factors will be, most of the people will be roofers, firefighters, military personnel, athletes, steel workers or field workers. So these are the ones who are usually affected by heat cramps. And because they don't take enough sodium before intense activity in heat, and there will be lack of heat acclimatization resulting in sweat with a high salt concentration. So salt is lost, sodium is lost in the sweat. The patient will just drink water. So there is going to be hyponatremia. So there will be hyponatremia, even hypokalemia, and hypochloremia also occurs. So all these lead to the cramp formation. So the patient, you have to just rehydrate the patient with IV fluids or oral rehydrating solution. Next one is, there are two more entities which are called as heat exhaustion or heat stroke. So what is heat exhaustion? Heat exhaustion is the core temperature, it is usually elevated, but it is generally less than 40.5 degrees Celsius. It is less than 105 degree Fahrenheit. What are the precipitants? Okay, one is water depletion, the other one is sodium depletion. These two, either that or this or both in combination, can cause heat exhaustion. Usually who are affected? The people who are affected are laborers, athletes, elderly individuals who exert in hot environments and they don't take fluid, they don't take adequate fluid. Symptoms will be headache, vertigo, ataxia, impaired judgment, malaise, dizziness, nausea, and even muscle cramps. The patient may also have orthostatic hypotension and sinus tachycardia. So what should you give? You have to give rapid infusion of isotonic IV fluids, and you have to check electrolytes often, and if necessary, electrolytes have to be corrected. So, and in these cases, sometimes hepatic aminotransferases are mildly elevated, and the urinary sodium and chloride concentrations are usually very less because body itself does not have any sodium and chloride, they are lost in the sweat. So this I'll tell in the last. The other one is, the last entity is heat stroke. This is quite it's a serious condition where you need to admit the patient. So there is total loss of thermoregulatory function. The patient has tachypnea, tachycardia, hypotension, even a wide pulse pressure. You have to, how do you diagnose? If the patient is exposed to a heat stress, there is CNS dysfunction, and the core temperature is more than 40.5 degrees Celsius. So more than 105 degree Fahrenheit, you diagnose this. The patient will have weakness, dizziness, disorientation, ataxia, or gastrointestinal or psychiatric symptoms. So there are two types again. One is classical or epidemic heat stroke. The other one is essential heat stroke. So this classic or epidemic heat stroke, this occurs in patients who have chronic disorders. They have some chronic illnesses, and in those patients this occurs. So this occurs when does this occur? It occurs in long periods of high ambient temperature and humidity, especially in the summer heat waves. There are some heat waves, especially in the tropical countries. Whenever there is summer heat waves, this classic heat stroke occurs. The patients already have chronic diseases and they are predisposed to heat related illnesses. And these people, they may have limited access to oral fluids. If everyone is, even if they are exposed to heat, they are rehydrating themselves with good oral fluids, they are not going to be affected with heat stroke. These patients, they don't have access to oral fluids, they are affected with heat stroke. Sweating will cease and skin will be very hot and dry. If cooling is delayed, then there will be malfunction of the liver, renal failure occurs, there can be disseminated intravascular coagulation, and even MODS can occur. So multisystem organ failure can also occur. AST will be typically elevated, platelets, fibrinogen and prothrombin will be decreased, and even leukocytosis will be there. Stress-induced leukocytosis will be there in these patients. The other thing I told is exertional heat stroke. As compared to the classic heat stroke, this occurs in previously healthy people, healthy young people who are usually athletes, laborers, or military recruits. And they will have a profusely diaphoretic phase despite the severe dehydration. In spite of the dehydration, these people, they sweat a lot. As a result of muscular exertion, there will be rhabdomyolysis and acute renal failure also occur. And acute renal failure is very common in this group of heat stroke people. So this is a marathon runner who met with heat stroke and he fell down. He could not finish his marathon. So what happens is there will be hyponatremia, hypoglycemia, and coagulopathies can also develop. Creatine kinase will be elevated. LDH also will be elevated. Urine output will be very decreased. Renal failure can result either from direct dermal injury, untreated rhabdomyolysis, or because of less volume depletion. It can occur because of dermal injury. It can be because of rhabdomyolysis or volume depletion. On examination of the urine, you will have microscopic hematuria, myoglobinuria, and granular or red cell CAS. So you have to do cooling strategies for both classic and exertional heat strokes. So you have to just intubate the patient, endotracheal intubation is done, and the continuous core temperature is monitored. For hypoglycemia can be corrected with the glucose infusion, and isotonic crystalloids has to be given for hypotension. And if this is preferred, you give more of isotonic fluids as compared with alpha adrenergic agonists. Dopamine and all are not advised. The IV fluids, IV boluses are more useful. The other method is evaporative cooling, where the cool water is sprayed. The 15 degrees Celsius water is sprayed on the exposed skin, and fans will be directed, and they'll have to give continuous airflow over the moistened skin. So this will cause loss of temperature. Cold packs can be applied to the neck, axilla, and groin. There is another method where you can, it is called as immersion cooling. You can put the person in ice cold water, but this has to be done in a very, it is useful only for young patients, because you cannot just put a older person or elderly person with comorbid conditions in ice cold water. That will cause other problems like cardiac arrest. So in young patients, preferably healthy patients, you can use this. You can just immerse the patient in ice cold water, but you have to monitor, and if necessary, resuscitation has to be done immediately. Active cooling should be terminated once the temperature comes to 38 to 39 degrees Celsius. And just a little slide on heat exhaustion versus heat stroke. So what are these? Heat exhaustion, the patient will feel faint or dizzy. Heat stroke, patients complain more of a throbbing headache. Heat exhaustion, the patient will have excessive sweating. Heat stroke, the classical heat stroke will be dry and there will be no sweating, but the exertional heat stroke, they have sweating also. Heat exhaustion, the skin will be cool and clammy. Heat stroke, it will be red, hot, and dry skin. Nausea, vomiting is present in both the conditions. Pulse will be very weak in case of heat exhaustion as compared to, there will be a strong pulse in case of heat stroke. There will be muscle cramps in case of heat exhaustion, and the patient will lose consciousness in case of heat stroke. So this is how you differentiate between heat exhaustion and heat stroke. Heat stroke is more dangerous, so you need to admit the patient immediately. That finishes all my topics for this semester.